On behalf of the Council, I'd like to welcome you all here to a Foreign Policy Panel Series event on Africom. In February 2007, President Bush announced the creation of a unified military command for Africa, placing the continent, in terms of the U.S. military command structure, on the same level as the Southern, European, Central, Northern, and Pacific Rim commands. But from the beginning, the move has been met with considerable controversy at home and abroad. Many military analysts have argued that the growing strategic importance of Africa necessitates a dedicated regional command rather than having various regions in Africa considered within the purview of several different U.S. military commands, leading to various inefficiencies. But some suggest that the command was motivated by more specific concerns, including specifically the rise of China, China's influence on the continent, and access to oil and other strategic materials. Many Africans view this shift in emphasis with something less than enthusiasm, and in fact the U.S. has had difficulties in lining up a suitable location in Africa for the command's headquarters. South Africa, as well as Nigeria and the 14-nation Southern African Development Community, oppose Africom. Adding to the uncertainty is that this will be a unified command, combining military and civil functions, while, like other regional commands, Africom is headed by a military four-star. The deputy will be a State Department official. This brings up an additional group of questions about the appropriate role for the military, the State Department versus the Defense Department roles in relation to sovereign states and development assistance issues, and more. Suspicions were further encouraged by the absence of specific information about the command, its purposes, and its methods of operations. Tonight, we have gathered an exceptional panel of individuals to help us work through some of the issues surrounding Africom, and we thank them all for participating. Moderating this evening's program is Sean McFate, Program Director, Partisan Policy Center. He is joined by Gayle Smith, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, Ambassador Mark Bellamy, Senior Fellow, Africa Program and International Security at CSIS, and Major General Arnold Fields, United States Marine Corps retired, Deputy Director, Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Mr. McFate is a defense policy and fragile state specialist. After service in the United States Army, primarily as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division, he worked as a program manager with DynCorp International, helping to design and lead several peace-building programs in Africa, including demobilizing and rebuilding the armed forces of Liberia, retraining Burundi's Presidential Guard, and professionalizing the Sudanese People's Liberation Army. He holds a master's in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and is completing his PhD at the London School of Economics. He will be introducing our panelists this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel of distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. I would like to take just a few minutes to sort of set up a little bit about what Africom is and how it got to be where it is today, and then let our panelists get deeper into some of the issues that surround it. It's a very exciting event that is drawing both enthusiasm and ire from the policy world, not just in Washington, D.C., but very much so in Africa and the world at large. To understand a little bit about why this is getting so much attention, it's important to realize how the Pentagon views our planet. They view our planet in many ways through this thing called the Unified Command. Basically, a unified command, an example would be Central Command, or CENTCOM, is the largest sort of operational unit that the Pentagon has. It's in charge of coordinating all operations, in this case, in a given territory. Other unified commands do a function, like Special Operations Command. But there are just a handful of territory-based unified commands. Historically, Africom never had a sort of a Department of Defense unified command that was focusing just on Africa. This is a legacy in some ways of the Cold War. During the Cold War, Africa was never seen as strategically significant to U.S. security interests. If anything, it was seen as a battle proxy ground between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. But this all changed in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell down, knocked down, excuse me, and then the whole security landscape of the world changed dramatically. Since then, the Department of Defense has recognized that Africa has grown significantly in its strategic importance. This is due to a number of factors that Hadi had mentioned. They range from, range from fragile states. For example, Afghanistan and the ungoverned territories of Afghanistan help fester and create and incubate terrorists. This can happen with the fragile states' willingness or not. In some ways, fragile states are very much victims rather than victimizers. But new strategic threats can emerge from fragile states, whereas before 9/11, fragile states were considered just a humanitarian issue, mostly. Second is that other issues concerned vital natural resources like oil, certainly issues like China, which may or may not be seen as a threat. But there's a whole range of reasons why Africa matters now to the Department of Defense, where it didn't matter 20 years ago to the Department of Defense to the degree it matters today. So Africom was seen as a way to remedy this, because prior to this, unified commands, Africa was split between three: European Command, or EUCOM, Central Command, or CENTCOM, and Pacific Command, or called PACOM. This had several deleterious effects for U.S. security policy and engagement in Africa. The first is that it created seams. For example, Darfur is on a seam between CENTCOM and EUCOM, which could mean that coordinating a joint U.S. effort in that region could be complicated by the fact that you have two major unified commands figuring out who is supposed to do what. Now Africom just has all of Africa with the exception of Egypt because of its relationship with Israel. Second is, as a result, Africa was never on the top of any unified command's priority list. EUCOM was always focused mostly on Eurasia issues, CENTCOM was focused on the Middle East, and so forth. Third is that there was never, because of this, there was never really a dedicated core of Africanists within the Department of Defense. And fourth is that it matters to have a four-star general as an advocate for African issues. And now with Africom has its own four-star general who can go to the Hill, can go to the White House, go to the Pentagon, and sort of help craft more sensible, hopefully, U.S. strategic engagement in Africom. But Africom has turned into more than just an administrative change within the Pentagon. It has been seized or has been seen as an opportunity to create what many consider to be a post-Cold War experiment that takes the lessons learned of the Balkans and peacekeeping missions and in Iraq and Afghanistan and recognizes that sometimes combat operations are not the best way to achieve stability, and that sometimes post-conflict operations and, better yet, prevention is a better way to achieve stability, and especially in a continent of crisis. So accordingly, Africom has engaged a new strategic paradigm, one that views security and development as inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing. And this has required it to take on tasks that have been traditionally performed by development agencies such as USAID. This has caused great concern. This has caused great concern for a lot of reasons. One is that generally critics ask, does this represent the militarization of U.S. foreign policy? Is this a symptom of the great current imbalance, many think, between civilian and military authorities and resources currently in the U.S. government? Second of all, it has issues of African perceptions. African countries, writ large, for the most part, with the exception of Liberia, have publicly said they don't want anything to do with Africom. And they look at, given the legacy of colonialism and natural resource exploitation and what CENTCOM is currently prosecuting 2 wars in the Middle East, they're thinking, no, we really don't want this in our backyard. And there's some other issues that our panel will probably raise. I would, before I introduce the panel, would also like to separate into 2 different issues I think are important. There is the issue of Africom, the idea. Is it a good idea? Is the strategy it's representing, is that a good way for national security policy to sort of focus for the early 21st century. The second issue is the issue of the rollout of Africom. In many ways, Africom has had a challenging first year. And the panel and questions and answers, we can discuss a little bit more about that. But should these two issues be linked or not, and if they are separated, then what does that mean? We are quite fortunate, as Heidi said, to have a very distinguished panel. I think between the three here, we have almost a century of experience in Africa. First speaking will be Ambassador... Okay, half a century. First speaking will be Ambassador Mark Bellamy. Ambassador Bellamy, we're very lucky to have him. He's currently a senior resident fellow at CSIS, but he's a career Foreign Service officer for the U.S. State Department. His last major post before was ambassador to Kenya. This is significant because Kenya, in some ways, is a hub for U.S. I guess engagement, and forgive me, Ambassador Bellamy, for being undiplomatic about it. So it's a hub of U.S. engagement for basically the northeast quadrant of Africa. And the programs that he oversaw, I think you have his bio in front of you, are very much reminiscent of the ones that Africom will have to and is looking forward to engaging in. So he brings a great deal of experience in that. Beyond that, I will just say that Ambassador Bellamy has been pretty much a career African diplomat, has a great deal of experience. He's been posted to South Africa and elsewhere. And without further ado, sir, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Kenya's a hub, but it's a good place to vacation also. Well, I want to thank the World Affairs Council for organizing this event this evening. You've heard a little bit from Heidi and from Sean about Africom. I think it's probably fair to say that apart from operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, no other military initiative, DoD initiative in recent months has gathered quite as much attention or sparked quite as much debate as the decision to create a unified command for Africa, announced by President Bush back in February of 2007. Sean asked, is it a good idea? However you regard that decision, it seems to me that it's hard to disagree with the proposition that it's probably an idea whose time has come, if only because the current system is not working very well. That current system, as you've heard described, consists of having Africa treated sort of as an afterthought by three different regional commands, each of which has different priorities and each of which is looking elsewhere. So to have a unified command whose specific and exclusive focus is Africa ought to be welcome news to all of us who recall how difficult it has been historically to focus and generate U.S. government interest in Africa. The creation of Africom gives us an important new interface with Africa and potentially a source of funding and resources to bring to bear on Africa's challenges. So all of that is potentially good news. There's also less good news in the creation of Africa Command. There has been worry here in the United States, in the interagency and other departments of government in Congress and elsewhere, that the creation of Africom really risks leading DoD into areas where it really ought not perhaps to be heavily engaged. There are fears that tasks that belong to civilian agencies, such as humanitarian assistance or development assistance, are going to be taken over by DoD and run under military leadership. There have been concerns in Africa that the creation of this command could lead to the stepping up and basing of U.S. forces in Africa. It could lead to the militarization, overall militarization of our policies in Africa. There are concerns that maybe this is really an outgrowth of the global war on terrorism, and what this is going to result in are U.S. forces going out and running down terrorist threats, real or imagined, in Africa's Muslim communities. So there are a number of misgivings out there, both here in Washington, in the U.S., and in Africa, surrounding the creation of this command, I suppose. But the best that one could say, at least from an African perspective, on the creation of this is that the reaction has been muted. Not the positive reaction I think that many here would have hoped. The immediate challenge that the new Africom commander, General Ward, faced when he took up this position last October, was to acknowledge and to address some of these concerns. And I think that he's taken some steps to begin to redress a bit of the deficit that Africom accumulated in its first year of existence. One of the important steps he's taken is to take off the table this issue of where is this command going to be located. There was a great deal of initial debate over the basing of a headquarters someplace in Africa. This became a real source of discord between the State Department and the Defense Department. It was a debate that was reflected in the Africa media. It was a debate that really detracted from the more important question of what is this command going to do, and what do we want its mission to be. And by wisely taking that issue off the table and saying we will decide that later on, I think a source of discord was removed. Similarly, I think General Ward has done a good job of scaling back expectations and slowing down the pace a little bit in terms of creating these new interagency structures that would go out and operate in Africa ostensibly under military leadership. There were early plans to early suggestions that Africom would create what some would see as miniature embassies or as regional embassies under military leadership, consisting of AID and state and CIA personnel and so forth. And this immediately raised concerns about chief of mission and ambassadorial authority, and again about the appropriateness of DoD leading diplomatic and development efforts in Africa alongside and maybe even in competition with our embassies. And here again, I think General Ward has stepped back a little bit from some of these more experimental ideas and decided that let's focus first on the mission, and then we'll decide on exactly where we want to put ourselves and how we want to structure our organization. At the end of the day, there are deadlines, and this has to be set up as a fully operational command on October 1st. But it seems that the way that General Ward is going about this is to, rather than emphasize haste and getting something up and running, it's to do this right and to take the time necessary to build this in the correct fashion. So I hope that they will adopt a fairly flexible definition in October of what fully operational means. At General Ward's invitation, several colleagues and I at CSIS put together a memorandum recently with some recommendations on the way forward. And with typical openness, General Ward had invited us to go ahead and post that memorandum on our website. So if you're interested, you can find our recommendations on the CSIS website. But I thought I would just highlight for you all 4 of the things that we had to suggest on how to overcome some of the problems that Africom has encountered, and how best to move forward in the remaining months before becoming fully operational. One of the first recommendations, and maybe the most obvious one, is the absolute importance of defining what the mission is for Africa Command. And within that, a strong recommendation that Africom's basic focus really ought to be on a back-to-basics approach. That is an approach that's focused on traditional military-to-military assistance programs in Africa. This is something we know how to do. This is a non-controversial area where we do have a lot of experience, and there is practically no limit to the need for reform and professionalization of Africa's militaries. Now, Africom could undertake to build that capacity, as we have done episodically in the past, but to do so in a more coherent, more effective, better resourced, and more sustainable fashion than ever before. And given the amount of work to be done in this area, given the wide range of improvements that are needed, there ought to be no need initially for Africom to venture experimentally into other areas which have been traditionally civilian-led areas of activity in Africa. A second recommendation that we make is that Africom consider focusing resources on maritime security in Africa. I think most of this audience is probably aware of the increasing importance of oil and gas exports from Africa to the United States. In the next few years, we'll import 25% of our oil from West Africa, primarily, and a lot of that is offshore oil. But beyond that, Africa's waters, maritime zones, are largely unpoliced and are subject to increasing problems of narcotics trafficking, human trafficking in persons, weapons trafficking, the theft of offshore oil, smuggling, piracy, overfishing, environmental degradation, a whole host of issues that have serious consequences for human security in Africa. African governments themselves are just beginning to grapple with these challenges, but historically have placed a very low priority on navies and coast guards. I think there's a lot of room for potential collaboration between Africom, Africa Command, and African governments in the areas of maritime security, and collaboration that's not just collaboration that may have immediate benefits in terms of protecting populations and addressing issues of human security. Third recommendation, and this follows a little bit from Secretary of Defense Gates' remarks at Kansas State University not so long ago. We've recommended to General Ward that Africom make a strong pitch for a doubling of the State Department's budget for security assistance programs in Africa. Increase the funding available and increase the personnel available to the State Department for African security programs. There's probably no better way to increase confidence in interagency cooperation than for the State Department to be given the resources it needs to prioritize and plan and design security assistance programs, which Africom will also participate in the design of, but then carry out. Right now, an enormous imbalance exists within our government, and this is perhaps one of the reasons behind Africom coming into existence in the beginning. And this imbalance is simply one of the State Department and USAID having the authorities but not having the resources to do the work they need, and DOD having the resources, ample resources, but not the authorities. The correction here is not to give DOD more authorities to do developmental and diplomatic work, but rather to correct that imbalance by making sure that all agencies of government are adequately funded. And Africom could make an important contribution, it seems to us, in calling for those increase in State Department resources which Africom then will be able to draw on in the security assistance programs. Finally, we make a recommendation that Africom reach out to the United Nations and UN peacekeeping operations. I mean, we sometimes tend to forget that the UN is present in every corner of Africa, usually in a security or peace-building capacity. And whatever the operational shortcomings may be of the UN or UN peacekeeping operations, the fact is that the UN is respected and supported in virtually every African country and across the board in terms of African publics. And that's a reality that our forces and that Africom need to link to, systematically to. There is probably, to the extent that Africa Command is perceived as being supportive in Africa of UN peacekeeping efforts and of security building efforts on the part of the UN, acceptance and recognition in Africa will grow. But conversely, to the extent that Africom is perceived as working against UN interests or in conflict with UN interests, I can't think of anything that would more quickly undermine Africom's credibility or undermine its welcome in Africa. So there is a need for Africom to connect early on with the UN and to work to develop ways in which it can collaborate effectively and be seen to be collaborating effectively with UN peacekeeping and security building operations in Africa. Those were our 4 recommendations. I mean, I'm sure there are others, probably better recommendations out there. Whether those recommendations are utilized or acted on, I don't know. But whether those or others are accepted, there's one final point, it seems to me, that is worth emphasizing here. And if it's important, it seems to me, that we present and operate Africa Command as an enduring, long-term investment in Africa. If it is perceived by Africans as a serious long-term commitment, one in which we are serious about building partnerships with African governments, I think over time it will win acceptance and it will find a place. If we make the mistake of treating this as sort of an afterthought or a sideshow in the global war on terrorism, and if our engagement is episodic, as it has been in the past, then I think Africom may well have a short and unhappy lifespan. So I think if there is one important message that we ought to be conveying as regularly as we can, it ought to be one of a long-term commitment in partnership with African governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bellamy. Next, we'll turn to General Arnie Fields. General Arnie Fields is currently the Deputy Commander of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at National Defense University. Africa Center for Strategic Studies I think it's a unique organization. It's in the Department of Defense, and it serves in some ways as a strategic think tank for U.S.-African strategy. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect, I think, of ACSS is the fact that it's only, what, 10 years old?
1999.
Nine. Yeah, almost 10 years. Yeah. Which is, I think, remarkable that we would only, in 1999, think of the Department of Defense of doing this. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm on?
You're on.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
You're the only one who can get out.
I will speak from over here. First, let me say how honored I am to be here this evening, and I thank you for having come to hear what we have to say tonight. Look forward to your questions, as long as they're easy ones. I'm very honored to join this distinguished panel here this evening on an issue of very contemporary debate, but I would like to say, as Ambassador Bellamy just said, that in the long run, Africom will prove and measure up to meet the full measure of expectations that those who put it in place had, and that within that context, the Africans and the contiguous islands thereof will learn to appreciate the dimension that Africom at least has the potential to bring to that particular region of the world. I have elected tonight, during my 10 or so minutes, to speak specifically about the Africa Center. Why? Well, first off, I think the Africa Center represents, to some extent, some of the paradigm shifts that by which Africa Command might be described. But I will also say in the same breath that the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, as I just suggested, was stood up long before Africa Command perhaps was even thought of, and certainly before it stood up. So another dimension of this is that we actually report to Africa Command, and that is the connectivity that led me to decide that I will be less philosophical in my remarks and more specifically on what we do and perhaps the contribution that we bring or make to Africa Command and the overall security structure. The essence of what I plan to address tonight are those elements. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies is one of 5 regional centers, each of which reports to the Secretary of Defense, and each is aligned with the combatant commands to which Sean McFate made reference in his opening remarks. In other words, there is a means by which we address essentially the globe from the standpoint of the Defense Department when it comes to our national security and the role that the Defense Department plays in that regard. So, as you can see from the slide, that we have the Africa Center, which covers, of course, Africa and the contiguous islands. We report currently through the commander of U.S. European Command to the commander Africa Command, because right now it is a sub-unified command, as we say in military language, and it in fact reports to the commander U.S. European Command. The Asia Pacific Center, which was stood up in 1995, is located in Hawaii. It reports to the commander of U.S. Pacific Command. The Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, or CHIDS as we say in short, its headquarters is in Washington at the Coast Guard building, but its work is in Central and South America. And that organization reports to the combatant commander of Southern Command. There is the Marshall Center, which stood up in 1993 and is the oldest of the 5 centers, and it is born out of the old Russian Institute. And that director and that center report to the commander of U.S. European Command. And most recently established in year 2000, in fact, the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. And that center's headquarters is in Washington at the Coast Guard building, but their work is principally in the Persian Gulf, Southwest Asia, primarily the Islamic community of that area of the world. I thought it was good that I kind of put these centers in perspective for you. Again, they all report to the Secretary of Defense. They report to their respective combatant commander, and they are all at or about the same size. Some may be a slight bit larger than others. Here is the mission. The mission is essentially born out of guidance that we receive from the Secretary of Defense, passed directly to us, but with the oversight of at least 3 elements. First, the Office of Secretary of Defense, the combatant commanders, as I mentioned earlier, and the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which provides our executive oversight. Money is funneled through them. They have the general counsel oversight in ensuring that we do things in the right way. But our guidance for what we do really comes from the Office of Secretary of Defense. And where we do it and the kinds of things we do, we vet those matters with the respective combatant commander. Here are some highlights to show you some of the kinds of things that we do. Let me state up front that we are an academic organization. We are not an operator. We don't train folks how to fight and maneuver, but we do address those elements of leadership and civil military relations and the like that help to support their requirements as maneuvering forces. But we really operate at the strategic level of the African leadership community. The Senior Leader Seminar, for example, is our capstone course for the year. It's only 2 weeks. There's no grade in it. We assemble folks at a certain location, either in Africa or in the United States. The next one will be in June, right here in Washington. We bring in the most senior leaders that we can bring in and who elect to accept our invitation. And we provide for them what we would like to say is a very high level of dialogue, creating an environment within which they mostly talk to themselves about their issues. And we just help guide them, applying certain principles as the need might suggest. The next generation of African military leaders is one of our newest courses. It is the only exclusively military group to which we present. Everyone else, it's mixed, about 50-50, civilian in the security sector and military. And this slide just shows an array of issues that we address, most of which are regionally oriented and topical and in reference to the region within which we conduct. For example, look at the bottom one there, maritime safety and security, that was mentioned earlier. We focus on that because it is important to the Africans, and we try to get them to work together toward common goals and issues born out of maritime safety and security. That idea essentially characterizes other matters that we address, such as what we did recently with the Economic Community of West Africa, or ECOWAS, in a conference that we just recently completed in Bamako, Mali. Counterterrorism is a major part of what we do in terms of the kinds of environments that lead to terror, not addressing terror in the sense of what we may be doing in Iraq or Afghanistan and places like that. We speak with and to the Africans. We also speak to our own community. We have a seminar that we hold for U.S. folks who have under their arms an African portfolio, and they would like to know what Africa is all about, what the challenges that Africa now faces, what our U.S. policies are thereunto pertaining, and so we assist them in that regard. And my slide thing here just went down, so I'll just step over here and talk. I don't know if I can, okay, I can move that forward. A principal piece of what we do is community outreach, whereby folks who come and attend our program become a part of the Africa Center family. And we, to some extent, nourish that family, and I'll move through this a little bit more quickly here. And we support the establishment of Africa Center chapters, now represented in 19 of the 53 African countries. This is a means by which we extend the dialogue beyond the 1 to 2 weeks to a month that any participant might spend in the classroom. And we really feel that it is under those circumstances that we really make our money, if you will, and less so in the 1 to 2 week or 1 month more formal seminar and conference environment. We are privileged to say that over the course of the 10 or so years that we have been in existence, we have had over 3,000 participants in our program, and they in fact make up in large measure the chapters to which I made reference earlier. We do plan to reach out physically to Africa. We have established an extension of our organization in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. We have just been granted authority to set up an office in West Africa. Specifically, it'll be in Dakar, Senegal. And we plan to replicate this in other areas of Africa, specifically North, Central, and Southern Africa, not South Africa per se, but Southern Africa. So that's kind of a roll-up of what I just talked about. We are a center, academic in its makeup and in its presentations, and in so doing, and in working for and with the Department of Defense, we hope to make a contribution to the national security of our United States as well as to that of the African community. So with that, I'll get off a transmit. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. Ms. Gayle Smith is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She has a great deal of experience in Africa. Recently, from 1998 to 2001, she served as a special assistant for African Affairs at the National Security Council. Previously, she was a senior advisor to the administrator and chief of staff of USAID. And before that, 20 years in Africa as a journalist. In this time, she has won numerous awards. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and she sits on several large boards of NGOs, including Oxfam America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to agree with the ambassador and thank both him and the general. ACSS is a really good and important institution and one that is very focused on capacity building. And Mark, I think your recommendations were right on the money. I'm here in what I hope is constructively critical mode. I actually think Africom is something that has a couple of very good concepts within it, but at least one is in the wrong body, that the process was flawed and that it was born prematurely. And I think that while some of those things can be rectified, it's really an illustration, with all due respect, of how not to make and implement policy, because it kind of came out of the oven, I think, well before it was ready. In listening to Mark, his primary recommendation I agree with 100%, but that is that Africom should have a clear mission. If that's the recommendation, Africom shouldn't, frankly, be out of the box yet, because really that should have been clarified beforehand. Let me talk about a couple of the concepts in Africom. One of them that I think everyone presumes is right on the money is this notion of a single command for Africa. I happen to think that's a good idea, but I think there are a couple of dangers there that we need to be mindful of. The assumption is that by having a single command that will elevate Africa within the foreign policy making apparatus. I think there's the potential for that. There's also the danger of its segregation. If you look at, for example, the field of women in development, in every case I've seen where somebody sets up an office for women in development, it's check the box and that's done. And one of the struggles in foreign policy that I think all of us know well from working on Africa is how do we make Africa part of our foreign policy national security discussion rather than having those discussions and then having the 22 people who work on Africa have a separate meeting. So a single command can be a good thing, but there's still got to be an aggressive effort to push it up the list of priorities. Second, there's still a need to integrate some of what the Africa Command does with other commands. If you look at capital flows, both legal and illegal, migration patterns, trading patterns, the movement of terrorist cells, one could argue that much of North Africa could still be in EUCOM or should be closely coordinated with EUCOM, much of the Horn of Africa with CENTCOM. So it's also important that there be an integration. But the other element of the concept, even though this has been dialed back a bit, has a lot to do with development, war prevention, human security. And some of that was informed by the experience of the Department of Defense in the Combined Joint Task Force in the Horn of Africa, which was deployed to Djibouti shortly after September 11th, and where people quickly recognized that the mission, which was in part to enable governments in that region to ensure their own security and thereby enhance ours, was that most of the governments in the region don't control their borders because it's very difficult to do so. That in a lot of remote areas of these countries there are not social services, and therefore governments do not have the legitimacy they might and do have a vulnerability to groups that may come in and say we will provide various services. And that poverty was so profound that it provided and continues to provide a breeding ground for extremism. I don't want to say terrorism networks automatically move to impoverished areas, but I think there's a connection between the vulnerability to extremism and the lack of hope that can often come with poverty. So one of the conclusions drawn was that we've got to do more than just capacity building. We've got to do development. We've got to answer the mail on some of these huge gaps. I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a question about whether that belongs in the Defense Department, but I'll come to that later. A second critical piece of this has been consultation with Africa. Now, there have been attempts to rectify this, and reference was made to African perceptions. I don't think the reaction from Africa was one that was knee-jerk, was some leftover remnant of anti-imperialism of the 1970s. I think it was based in the fact that there wasn't really any meaningful consultation. This is not a particular criticism of this administration. The African crisis response was launched when I was in the Clinton administration. Everybody thought it would be received with bells and whistles, and oops, there wasn't quite the amount of consultation that needed to happen. I was in the office of the head of state when the first Bush administration intervened in Somalia, great humanitarian intentions. None of the governments in the region had been consulted. They learned about it on CNN. That wasn't so good either. The consultation with Africa that is so critical now, though, I think has a lot to do with a number of things. Africa is looking to us for substantive and strategic coordination and consultation. Not an after the fact, here's what we're going to do, we think it's a good idea, it will help you, do you agree? There's also something going on in Africa, and reference was made to China. I am not one who subscribes to the notion that China is taking over and the world is doomed, but I do think what the expansion of China's role in Africa has meant is that we're in an era not unlike the time when we saw the rise of the non-aligned movement, where there are now, in essence, at least in Africa, two superpowers. And that means that Africa, in an ironic way, has some choices to make and a little bit more independent. So there isn't the assumption, I don't think, that any one of us can come in and assume that what we offer is necessarily going to be taken. There's also a sovereignty issue, which is very profound. We invoke sovereignty frequently. It is just as strongly felt in Africa. And I think the feeling that this whole plan had been put in place for a large African command to be forward deployed in Africa raised some questions there. Also, and importantly, and this is one recommendation I would add to Mark's with respect to the UN, the formation of the African Union in Africa by Africans is of profound importance to Africa. It is imperfect. It is also the only entity on earth that went into Darfur for the first 4 years. It was the one that has gone into Somalia in that crisis. And there's a very ambitious plan for the AU, including to have standby forces in 5 parts of the continent, a lot that is not dissimilar to some of the thinking on Africom. So there's a question there. Where's the strategic capacity building we might do in support of the AU? So there were some very serious questions raised, I think as much out of kind of shock and awe than an outright rejection of the United States. Third is this notion of forward deployment, and as Mark rightly suggests, that has been taken off the table for the moment, but that's the kind of thing that it isn't dead yet, and I think it's something we've got to think very seriously about. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone here that the U.S. involvement in Iraq has shaped some opinions around the world. I think the conduct of the global war on terror has shaped some opinions, including in Africa by virtue of the role of the United States in, for example, Somalia. But there are other questions about forward deployment. If Rwanda happens and Africom is forward deployed in Africa, are we going to send troops in to stop it? And if we don't, what are the implications of that? In Darfur, or now Somalia, where the UN Security Council is talking about the equivalent of an emergency force, and the troops are not available. The Darfur force is supposed to be 28,000. There are now 9,000 deployed. Is the U.S. going to fill the gap? And again, what are the implications if we do have forces in the region and we say no? What if there's a coup or a crisis? Kenya was rightly mentioned as a hub, and Kenya is a hub, and it's been a very important hub for military and security reasons. We saw what happened in Kenya after the elections in December. What does a forward deployed facility of the U.S. military do in a situation like that? Fourth, I used to be the senior director at the National Security Council in charge of Africa, and one of the really fun things I did oftentimes was litigate between the Department of Defense and the Department of State. And I was entirely neutral. It came up most often when it was necessary to evacuate Americans from a given country, and the Defense Department would want to move quickly so as to minimize the risk, and the State Department would want to go slowly so as to continue diplomacy and efforts to resolve the situation on the ground. But I think the interagency process is a complicated and very messy one. I think the way Africom was originally conceived, unfortunately, further muddles rather than clarifying that. I think the notion that the deputy is from the Department of State is great, and Mary is a very good friend of mine, and I think a very competent person to have in that position. But this does raise questions about who's on first. I think one of the important facts here, though, is that I think part of what Africom is about is filling a vacuum in the interagency. And let me just say a couple of words about where the executive branch is on this broad field called development or human security or war prevention. We now have 24 U.S. government agencies, entities, initiatives, departments, or fully new agencies that provide foreign assistance and have some brief that one could broadly describe as having to do with development. We have no one on first. There is no one in charge of all of this. There's a new position in the State Department, but that position has no jurisdiction over our biggest foreign aid pipelines, including in the Department of Defense, which has seen the largest proportional increase in foreign aid of all U.S. government agencies over the last 5 years. So we have this unbelievable mess, a recognized need for the United States for security reasons, for the reasons of pursuing our interests in trade, in fighting poverty, and having a moral position in the world to promote development, and we have a vacuum. I'm not critical of the Department of Defense for stepping up to the plate. I think the State Department's dropped the ball, and what used to be our development agency, USAID, has been so weakened in staffing and in authority and relevance that it doesn't have the capacity. So we have a huge vacuum there. Africom may have been intended to fill that somewhat, but with respect, when I try to anticipate what a National Security Council meeting to coordinate would look like with Africom as originally envisioned, my head explodes. The fifth point on this is what is development really about? And I think it's quite significant and quite important that the Department of Defense has recognized how critical the development function is. I think one of the reasons they're able to do that is DOD is really the only agency in our executive branch that does long-term planning, that does regular analyses, that does gaming and scenarios, and looks out 5, 10, 15, 25 years. I would like to say that other agencies do that. I can attest to the fact that they don't. So DOD has recognized something important, but I think we have to think about what development is. It's not a collection of projects. It's not building schools. It's the process by which communities, societies, countries, regions, continents achieve the capacity and the capabilities that enable governments to function and that allow citizens to thrive, that enable them to become productive and forward-looking members of an international community. It is something that I would argue is a distinct field. President Bush talks about the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And Democrats have endorsed this notion. But development is not defense, and it's not diplomacy. It's something different. And with all due respect to the unmatched capabilities of the Department of Defense to do security sector reform, to do training of other militaries, to do coordination and ops support for humanitarian operations, DOD is not a development agency. It is not staffed with development professionals. And development and security are linked, but my fear is that we're seeing something where people working on national security and counterterrorism have recognized that poverty is a problem and development is therefore important. The development community has recognized that if you mention terrorism, you get to go to the meeting and you can get more money, right? So we have this conflation of counterterrorism and development. I went to a conference recently that was about pursuing human security as a strategy for counterterrorism. Now, at some level, one can make the argument that there is the connection, but I think it's both upside down and narrow. It's upside down in the sense that development is something that we should pursue for a number of reasons, and it will yield positive results for us on security, including counterterrorism. If it is primarily the focus of a counterterrorism strategy, I don't think we're going to get the results we want. And when you look at the challenges in Africa, counterterrorism is one of them. Weak and fragile states is one of them. Pandemics is one of them. Structural poverty is one of them. Climate change is one of them. Migration is one of them. Conflict is one of them. I would argue we need a development strategy that is broad and comprehensive that can be acted upon by multiple agencies. So the recommendation I would make to add to yours, can we go online and add to your moment? In addition to there being a focus not just on UN peacekeeping in Africom, but also the plans and ambitions of the African Union to provide for security and peacekeeping functions in Africa, would be that we ask some of the right questions and look at this through a comprehensive interagency lens. We have a tendency as a government, and I say this as a former government official who did it, to ask the wrong questions. And we have a proclivity to answer by moving the boxes around. When we did intelligence reform, the Department of Homeland Security, let's move the boxes around and give somebody else a function and create a new entity. I think the question is, what tools does the United States need to support the process of rendering Africa more secure? Not just in national security or counterterrorism terms, but in terms of governance, in terms of more economically secure and more stable both for Africans and for ourselves. If we ask that question, DOD has a role, an African command has a role, but there are other agencies that need to be at the table. And I think the most important thing that can happen, again, in addition to Mark's recommendations, is that we take a step backward again, ask what we need, and then look at the whole panoply of agencies that we have that are capable of contributing and start there, and then figure out what Africom's role is, rather than defining an Africom and then reshaping the rest of the interagency to meet it. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you.
See, we were so cogently losing.
Yes. And why don't we do three at a time? So you, sir, and ma'am, and here. Do the microphones.
My question would just be, I'd like to hear what the panel would have to say about the potential for Africom working with regional organizations within Africa, such as the African Union, or ECOWAS, or SADC, as opposed to just kind of cooperating with individual countries. What plans are there for regional cooperation?
Yes, ma'am.
My question is for either the general or the ambassador, and it's related to illegal migrants now currently trying to get into Western Europe. I'm wondering what would be the role, would a role be possible for Africom in that if the EU already has established first with the False Start and now with more partnerships with African governments, civil society, et cetera. But would Africom have any kind of role once it's fully operational?
Sir.
My question is for anyone on the panel, and it relates to what I would consider a sort of a dangerously macro view of the continent. We speak in general terms of Africa and Africans, but we're talking about a very diverse, complicated group of people on a huge landmass. So how do we inject into Africom sort of a more individualized and more specific perspective?
Thank you. Three good questions.
Go down the-
Sure, please.
Your question is really, really important. And I think that how we do that in Africom, I mean, I would certainly hope that the defense attaches that we've got based in most countries, I would argue we should have one in every country in Africa, could feed into an Africom to provide some of that. Because if you look at Somalia, South Africa, Chad, Nigeria, and Benin, you cannot make sweeping generalizations, and our response and our policies shouldn't be the same. But I think the more that can come from the ground up and inform Africom and, frankly, Washington than the other direction, I think that's a really big piece of it. If I can just tie that to your question on regional organizations, I don't know what the plans are of Africom to work for regional organizations. I would certainly advocate it. I think that's something that the United States needs to do across the board, in part because it's a trend in Africa. There's recognition in Africa that for a whole host of reasons, security, but primarily economically, it cannot hope to compete on the global market unless it forges regional blocks in much the same way that Europe has. And I think the more we do now work with ECOWAS and SADC and other regional organizations. We're not structured as a government to really focus on that. We don't have ways, except very exceptional ways with lots of waivers and bureaucracy, for example, to program funding to regional organizations out of our civilian agencies. So I would argue that would be a very important function.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with Gayle. You know, if Africom had its way, they would love to work with the regional organizations rather than bilaterally, simply because it's one-stop shopping, and it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to go to Addis Ababa and deal with them all in the same place than it is to deal with them piecemeal. The risk here is that these are still fragile institutions, and we're likely to have ambitions and plans and ideas and money and resources that can be overwhelming at times. And our expectations of what we want these regional organizations to accomplish may actually outstrip their capabilities. So we need to be reasonable, I think, and balanced. We would love to, you know, Africom would love, I'm sure, to go help them set up their 5 standby brigades, you know, that are the core of the new AU, you know, peacekeeping effort. But we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations about where Africa Union is in its own evolution. It's going to take time, and the regional, you know, for the time being, bilateral relations are going to remain very, very important, I think. And on the macro view of Africa, I completely agree with Gayle as well. You know, one of the most glaring examples of this is that Africom is for the first time is treating North and South Africa in one body. Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa are within the same command. Now, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are utterly different entities. The security situation in North Africa, I won't say it has nothing in common with Sub-Saharan Africa, but if you're talking about counterterrorism, for example, these are completely different sets of problems. In fact, these are, you know, North Africans are sometimes Africans when it's convenient to be African, and the rest of the time they're resolutely non-African. So there's an aggregation there that we need to be careful about. That said, I think that there is an awareness within the command that you can't talk about Africa generically. I think it's a little bit daunting when they consider that, you know, how many different African states that they have to deal with. That's a bit daunting.
I will comment on at least one of the questions, specifically that which deals with the regional organizations. And some of my comments here are personal as well as indicative of what is really happening on the ground, if you will. First, my going-in position is that Africom is an enabler. And as has been already stated, you can fit about 3 United States into the continent of Africa. So it's hard to employ individuals to deal with the vastness of Africa from a geographical standpoint, and equally from the diversity that exists in Africa in various levels, be it government, the people thereof, disease, war, and those matters. So it would be in the best interest of Africom to work with the regional organizations, making them stronger. Right now, I think my colleagues would agree that from a sub-regional standpoint, the economic community of West African states is probably the strongest of the sub-regional organizations. There are 15 members, 15 African states who are members of ECOWAS. They have helped us in a number of instances, probably most significantly and most recently, in addressing the situation in Liberia back in at about 2002. So there are mechanisms there on which I feel Africom could build and should build. And I agree with what has been said about the African Union. It is a developing organization. It is not mature. But we, the U.S. and sub-elements thereof, Africom and the Africa Center, of which I'm a part, are poised to lend assistance. But we cannot lend any more assistance than the sovereign nature of the states with which we work and the organizations that represent them will allow. Thank you.
Oh, yes, immigration.
Just a quick remark on the illegal immigration. I don't know. I'm not sure I know what the answer is either to that, except if I were, I suppose, an Africom planner, I would really not want to get anywhere near that particular issue. That's a very much a Europe-Africa concern. You know, we can do more to help African governments, as I said earlier, deal with maritime security issues. And we can do more to help them police their waters and to develop things like search and rescue capabilities and so forth. And we can develop, we can address some of the issues that are driving people to risk their lives on these perilous boat journeys. I'm not sure that's DOD's job to address those issues, as Gayle pointed out. But by and large, I would think that there's not a direct Africa command role in that particular crisis situation.
Anything good?
No.
Okay. Good. Some more questions, please. Okay, we'll do this side of the room. Madame, in the front, sir, and do we have microphones though, or do we need them? Okay, we'll just go with that.
Screen.
Okay.
Thank you to the panel for your frank comments today. I have three quick questions. One is that I noticed that MCC, the Million Talent Corporation, was having a discussion, and I'm wondering what your views are on integration, from the development perspective of MCC work. Second is the role of South Africa, how you perceive, I'm talking about the country of South Africa, how you perceive relations with Africa to that country. Third, I want to concur and thank Gayle for comments in terms of the development nexus here. And I think one of the issues with USAID is not only the budget cuts, but the switch in terms of the allocation of budgets out of productive assets into governance issues. And so we've had to put, USAID has had to move the governance issues away from areas like agriculture, water management, et cetera, which is really the focus of how we engage in these countries. So maybe a question in that regard. Thank you.
Sir.
I have two questions. The first is, to this point, how has Africom been talking to Africa, to African countries? Has it been the administration? Has it been military officials? Has it been talking to African governments wholesale in some kind of body? Or have they been talking to individual countries? And my other question is, Ms. Smith, you mentioned if Africom is forward deployed in Africa and something like a Rwanda happens, how do we react and what are the implications? To my knowledge, there are already a lot of territorial disputes in Africa. I work for an NGO that's funded by the Moroccan government, so I'm thinking Western Sahara, that's obviously a very big one. And would Africom have to take a position on some of these disputes in order to successfully engage these different African governments? Because I would think that could be difficult. And if so, how could Africom overcome that? Thanks.
In the back, please.
In her introduction, introductory remarks, Heidi said that African countries are against Africom. And Sean said something similar. He noted that African countries didn't want anything to do with Africom. Now, I didn't hear that same sentiment repeated directly by members of the panel. They mentioned why a number of U.S. agencies and others might be against Africom. But I wonder if the panelists agree that Africans are against Africom, and if so, why?
All right, the questions keep getting harder. So,
Okay. Briefly on the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was a new aid facility established by the Bush administration. It had bipartisan support, and it provides large grants to countries that are among the good performers. And I think there's merit in the notion of helping to consolidate gains in countries that are functioning well. I think it was a mistake to create a new and entirely separate agency to do this rather than to fix the other one, which is broken. But again, we've had this remarkable proliferation of aid agencies. And one of the outcomes of that, just a fun factoid, is that we've got all these 24 entities and nobody's on first, and we have a great deal of policy and coherence. So the MCC has a very large budget and makes very large grants, but the United States government actually collects more in tariffs from the MCC countries than we provide in grants. So we've got those kind of gaps all over the place. Let me just put together the Africom and South Africa and the Africans being against Africom. I think the reaction, and I referenced this, maybe I was elliptical in it, the reaction from Africa has been very negative. And I think it's been for a number of reasons. There really was not consultation. There was consultation after the fact rather than in the process of formulation. And I don't think Africans were looking for the United States to ask permission, but I think it was seen as a pretty bold presumption that the United States was going to forward deploy a command to Africa that had already figured out what it was going to do and hadn't really had those discussions with Africa. There's a profound question of sovereignty, number one. Number two, there was a real lack of clarity about mission. And I think in some cases that fueled the notion that the mission might be dubious. Maybe this is all about protecting oil. Maybe this is entirely a counterterrorism, counterintelligence operation. Whatever, but it raised more questions than it answered. And the forward deployment question, I think, was viewed by many as the notion of U.S. bases in Africa. And technically, in general, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it wouldn't actually constitute bases in the conventional sense of a U.S. military base, but it would be an installation and a more significant military presence on the ground than we presently have on the continent. So I think for all of those reasons, there was, if not an outright rejection, something other than a warm welcome. And there is a lot of effort being undertaken now to try to rectify that. And as Mark said, there's been a rolling back of the forward deployment notion, which may help. But it's a case where I think we were just very presumptuous. On the question of does Africom have to take a position on various crises? At one level, you can say no. But at another level, if there were forward deployment, and if we have this very robust Africom, and a lot of interagency involvement, and very forward-leaning effort, I think it puts the U.S. in a position that we ought to think through before we assume it, which is that if there is a crisis, if there is a fundamental gap in peacekeeping capacity, if there is an urgent need for lift, whatever it may be on the crisis front, if there is a need to undertake a major and complex evacuation, if Kenya had not come back under control but had spun out, I think it would be very difficult for Africom just to say, well, we don't really have a position on this. I think that there would be pressure on Africom, not only from Africa, but from Congress, from American citizens, to say, what are you going to do? You're there. And so I think that's the kind of thing that has to be thought out, and I'm not even necessarily arguing that a forward deployed Africom should undertake all those missions, but I think we better think very, very hard and clearly about the implications of being there and not doing it, because I think that poses problems in itself.
Gayle raises an important point about if you have forces deployed in Africa and a crisis comes up, you have to know ahead of time, you have to have an idea ahead of time what you're prepared to do. You cannot afford to have U.S. forces sitting in Africa and another Rwanda, and then you say, well, we really don't do genocide. That's not why we came.
Right.
We think in terms of, the global war on terrorism and needing to have our forces positioned to react to possible contingencies in that area and to train African forces. But the fact is there are other scenarios that we have to have thought through before we actually have forces there, and then there will be demands, as Gayle points out. In terms of territorial disputes and taking positions, I don't think Africom is not going to have a problem there because it's not their call. So the U.S. government has a position on the Western Sahara or on any other territorial dispute in Africa. The U.S. government has a position on Darfur, and Africom will simply hide behind whatever the U.S. government's position is, and will implement the U.S. government's position. So they're not going to worry about that. In terms of in terms of Africom's acceptance in Africa, and I think we all agree that it has been a rough first year for Africom in Africa. On one level, I think many African governments understand that this is a U.S. internal decision. They don't have a position on whether it should be UCOM or CENTCOM or PACOM or that's our internal business about how we organize ourselves to conduct business in different parts of the world. What, as Gayle points out, there is some concern about were the initial indications that this would entail a major change in terms of the way we maybe deploying forces, putting forces into Africa and so forth, and there were a lot of unanswered questions at the outset which created a certain amount of uneasiness. To be fair, there are some African governments that would welcome the deployment of U.S. forces. We know that Liberia has been an enthusiastic proponent of this, perhaps not for all the right reasons, but and there have been some other African governments that have been willing to host a headquarters element. Many others have been reluctant. It'll take some time, I think, to address these concerns. And I said before, I think that General Ward's doing a pretty good job of beginning to address those concerns.
Let me make a few comments. First, I wish to comment on the South Africa relations question. I don't think, well, first off, South Africa does not support the Africom idea. And with South Africa being a member of the SADC, that's the regional organization that has member states in Southern Africa, that position on Africom, I think, impacts the other member states, but it does not interrupt or preclude our engagement with them. For example, right now, ongoing as we speak, just down the street, so to speak, in Warrington, is what they're referring to as Early House 2, which is a conference focusing on Africa. The first Early House was held in September. The subject was Africom. About 100 senior leaders representing principally Africa, but also the United States and other countries were present. And the member states of SADC were present. But as I understand it, unless things changed in the past couple, 2-3 days, there was not a representative from the SADC organization itself, but the member states are represented at this conference. So I say that just to put in perspective this relationship with South Africa, which is very tenuous, not born, in my mind, out of Africom, but born more out of the perception from South Africa about the United States and the degree to which it was involved in ridding apartheid. And so I think that is really where the history of this relationship goes back. And I think we should probably de-link the two from Africa Command, even though some of the contributions, so to speak, can relate to Africa Command as well as to this more long-standing historical perspective. How has Africa been talking to Africom been talking to Africa? Well, I want you to know that nothing really has changed since the 6th of February last year when President Bush announced the stand-up of Africa Command. What do I mean by that? That we have had an ongoing dialogue, militarily and otherwise, with Africa for years. I mean, I was a part of that while I was on active duty and serving as a deputy commander of Marine Forces Europe, a part of which was responsibilities in Africa. I met with the African senior leaders. So that dialogue that was ongoing long before Africa Command is still ongoing. But now we can focus even more in that we have a dedicated four-star general and staff to carry out those duties. Countries against the stand-up of Africa Command, one of the responsibilities of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies was, right after the announcement of the stand-up of Africom, was to engage the African ambassadorial community here in Washington and to consult backwards. And I think Gayle has very adequately explained that we put the cart before the horse.
And then asked you to please turn it around.
And exactly. And so we've been trying to turn that thing around for over a year. And that's another one of the reasons this Airlie House 2 is ongoing as we speak. We have had high-level officials from the Department of Defense and the Department of State to make trips to Africa and have engaged in talks with the senior leaders. They've been to Europe. They have tried every mechanism possible to try to transcend what we did in error on the front end of this, and that was to fail to recognize the legitimate sovereignty of the nations of Africa, and were inclined to treat Africa more as one continent as opposed to 53 independent and sovereign nations, or something to that effect. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we're out of time.
Oh, okay.
So maybe additional questions to be asked of our panelists outside.
We'll break here. I'll give the panelists one last opportunity to make any final remarks, and if you have any questions, if the panelists have any time afterwards, would be great.
I think the only thing I would say is that Africom's already out of the box, so it's not possible to go back and start over. It's only possible to try to rectify the process, get the mission right, and so on and so forth. So I think the most important thing is to focus on that. And the second thing, I would just reiterate what I said at the top. I don't think we can afford to look at U.S. policy and towards an engagement with Africa through the lens of any single issue or any single agency. And that if we really want to get it right, and I think we've made progress over the years, what we need to do is step back and ask what the U.S. government needs across the board and then plot it out, rather than risking. I think what we've already seen is that the dangers of any one agency being so out ahead of the others that we end up with an imbalance.
I would certainly agree with that. I don't know that I have any brilliant concluding remarks, except except to note something that didn't come out, or that I should have mentioned earlier but didn't, and that is the sense to which I think within this new command, which is still being built, there is an awareness of how much we don't know about Africa, and how much, in particularly DOD and the military, doesn't know about Africa. And the fact that there is an awareness that we are on a pretty steep learning curve, I think, is actually positive. when you think about it, our military has had certainly less experience in Africa than the UK or the French, arguably the Portuguese or the Belgians, or the Indians or the Pakistanis, for that matter, as UN peacekeepers. And I think there's an awareness of that, that we are well advised not to rush into this, well advised to reach out and gather as much expertise as we can. And I'm sort of cautiously hopeful that attitude will be there to guide the development of this command.
I will close with a few remarks. First, when we conduct our programs at the Africa Center, we consistently apply the Chatham House rules, which means non-attribution. So what I'm about to say is in general and is not attributed to any entity of Africa or elsewhere. But there was a lot of suspicion among the Africans about our real intent, and those matters have been addressed by this panel, I think, sufficiently. And I think in large measure, born out of something that we sometimes do, and I believe other nations as well, we are reluctant to acknowledge our own national security interest, as if there's something wrong with acknowledging our national security interest. All nations have national security interests, good, bad, or indifferent. And I think if we were more open, we as nations, not exclusively the United States, more open, leaving less to the imagination of our partners and friends, if you will, there would be less suspicion about paradigm shifts such as that which are represented or will be represented by the Stand Up of Africa Command. So we should not deny our national security interest, but we should look for and seek areas of common interest and work toward that as an international community. Thank you.
I'll ask our panel and all our audience to join us for a reception in the lobby.
I apologize.